Hello and welcome to this presentation. I'm Nicos Sifakis. In this talk, I'm going to be discussing alpha-aware activities in practice for the ESOL or EFL classroom. And we're going to be looking at a handful of examples in a practical, hands-on way. So stick around. We are going to be looking at real-life textbooks and activities taken from them. The reason we're doing this is to show that it's possible to raise any textbook's alpha-awareness status by incorporating the right kind of questions. So textbooks typically, and I stress this word, textbooks typically use topics that on the surface tend to be culturally or interculturally sensitive, but really do not fully exploit them, because they're playing it safe, especially international textbooks. And this might be the case in your own CLIL context. Secondly, they incorporate rather traditional tasks. They adopt a traditional approach to activities. And these might be negatively impacted by high-stakes testing. So you're going to be having many questions that are comprehension-checking questions. And thirdly, textbooks typically do not favor reflective or meta-linguistic questions, which are exactly the questions we look for in alpha-aware activities. So in the first example, we're going to be looking at the notion of a large culture versus a small culture approach. And this is a notion that Adrian Holiday introduced in 1999. A large culture approach is a way of looking at a context that prioritizes communication between people from different cultures, and they would be typically understood to mean societies, different societies. For example, the US versus the Mexican, or the Greek versus the Turkish, the Taiwanese versus the Iranian, and so on. Very simplistic, reductionistic way of looking at culture. The question is, would this be more EFL or ELF? This is something that I let you wonder about. On the other hand, a small culture approach is more interpersonal and looks at communication between real life or individuals with significant differences in their cultural backgrounds, experiences, and identities. So, for example, in this case, we're looking at specific real life people, or we try to make the roles or characters that appear in textbooks take up a real-life existence. So the question to ask here is, would a small cultural approach be more relevant, more appropriate in an ELF context or an EFL context? Again, I'm leaving this question open for you to discuss with your tutor. What's important to remember for an alpha-aware intercultural communication pedagogy is that we want to engage learners in activities and interactions that promote authentic intercultural communication. In other words, we try to prompt our learners to become conscious, to become aware of their own personal attitudes toward ELF-related concerns. And they would be made to recognize that some of these attitudes are likely to be native speakerist. In other words, they promote the importance of a native speaker, or the prioritization of a native speaker in this particular EFL context. And the target here would be to try and shift or transform these attitudes. At the same time, we want to prompt our learners to become conscious of their own culturally acquired communication preferences, and to recognize that some of these attitudes are likely to be ethnocentric, and to try to transform or shift these attitudes. In other words, I believe that alpha-awareness is ideal for appreciating small cultures. Well, there you are. I've just given you the answer to the previous question. And that small cultures are ideal for raising alpha-awareness. Let's see how this can be done with an example. So have a look at this excerpt that is taken from a real textbook. Stop the video here and try to pay close attention to the rubric of this activity. When you finish, try to think of the large versus small culture tendencies vis-à-vis the two questions that you see in this activity. Which of these questions would be a large culture question and which would be a small culture question? That would be the task for you here. Well, as you can see, in 1.1 there's a focus on place as linked to the characteristics of people supposedly from that place. This is part of a large culture tendency which links a place, a people, a culture and a language as a package, which links a place, a people, a culture and a language as a package. And this conflicts with the way much of the world is. On the other hand, in 1.2, we have the encouragement to spot commonalities across societal and other lines, for example, ethnic. And this is an encouragement that is helpful for the small culture or interpersonal approach. Let's move on. Let's look at the next activity from the same textbook. Stop the video now and closely consider this activity. We can see here the linkage between climatic conditions leading to reified cultural differences in a kind of large culture perspective. But then you can wonder about, for example, Islamic ways of living distributed across the globe, from northern Sweden to South Africa and so on. In other words, we look at similarities despite climatic conditions. That would be more towards a small culture approach. But let's see how self-awareness can be raised here, in this very specific example, with the right kind of meta-cognitive and meta-linguistic questions. Have a look at these questions. You can add these questions to supplement the existing task. So we begin with, what kind of English would Nuru and Tiki use to communicate with you? This is a question that helps the learners imagine a possible elf situation, an interaction between themselves and the characters in this activity. Another question, do you think it would be British or American English? Do you think you may have a problem understanding them? What would you or they do in order to be understood? So there's a sense of raising your learners' awareness of the importance of intelligibility in elf interactions, and perhaps the realism of non-native speakers of English using their own elf ways of communicating with other people which are not British or American English. You can go further. In what ways would the English used by Nuru and Tiki help them understand and appreciate their cultural differences? People from different parts of the world and different upbringings may have different ways of communicating, and their English would be different. All of these instances of English would be valid uses of elf. And in what ways would it help them connect and identify their cultural similarities? Again, it's the same idea of connecting with another person who is not a native speaker of English at the same level with them through this cultural approach, intercultural communication. Now let's look at the next activity from the same textbook. Stop the video again and pay particular attention to the rubric and the text in this activity. The same activity moves on, it goes on to the next page. Again, stop the video here and see carefully the wording and the rubric. What you can do here is pose the following questions to your learners. This environment, the physical characteristics, represents an entrenched way of seeing the world, and that's absolutely true. But is it really like that anymore? So you pose this very realistic question and you make them realize how relevant the text that they've read is for their own personal understanding. Then you can ask them to link such differences to cultural and communicational differences. Essentially, you can ask your learners to be ethnographers of their own world and you can ask them to describe its patterns. The introduction of an anthropologist in the text opens the door to asking your learners to be ethnographers. The idea of language learners as ethnographers is a well-established one, and this seems a more useful starting point than anthropology linked to physical characteristics. What are the questions that you can ask when your learners become ethnographers of their own world? Very simply, ask about what they do with English, what they do themselves. Start from the general situation, from their hobbies. Do you enjoy playing video games? Do you chat with other players? What do you chat about? Now you focus on the subject of their interaction. No reference to language yet. How often do you talk about stuff other than the video games? What is this stuff about? So you prompt them to talk about their own interests and hobbies. Now you move on to the language used. What language do you use when you chat? Why do you use that language? Could it be English, for example? What do you do in order to understand and be understood by other players? Pointing towards accommodation strategies and becoming intelligible and comprehensible. And how would you describe the English that you use when you chat or Skype with your fellow players? Again, trying to raise the self-awareness and confidence as efficient users of English in their own real-life, authentic situation outside of the EFL classroom. So, let's take stock and see what we've done so far with ELF-aware task design. As you can see, in ELF-aware tasks, we do not teach ELF. This is really important. The point here is not to teach ELF, because you cannot teach ELF. You can only expose your learners to successful examples of ELF interactions. That's the important thing, exposure. Then you should find and expand upon your learners' own ELF speaker persona, what they do themselves with English, and in this way you help them gain confidence as non-native speakers. And then you can open up towards other ELF concerns, such as native speakerism, the importance of standard English, the ownership of the language, and so on. And the relevance of studying EFL in this particular context, even if it's a clear context, the importance of that with their own understanding of their own needs for English language learning. And this is exactly what integration of ELF means. We are not trying to replace EFL, but we are, in a sense, upgrading it with an ELF integration. We leave EFL tasks to do the job of teaching English, and we focus on facilitating interactions, providing feedback, and in this way boosting confidence. So, what have we done in this presentation? We've discussed the notion of ELF awareness. We referred to the importance of small cultures. We noticed the importance of cross-cultural communication, which involves a comparison of interactions among people from the same culture to those from another culture. We discussed the importance of intercultural competence, which involves interactions among people from different cultures. We highlighted the key importance of asking reflective questions that are metalinguistic and metacognitive. We also stressed the role of shifting attention to learners' attitudes and making them aware of their attitudes towards these concerns. And we also showed how realistic it would be to help them transform these attitudes and make them more ELF aware. So now it's practice time. What I'm asking you to do is use the same criteria mentioned above and do the following for your own teaching context. Very simply, select a particular unit or chapter from your own CLIL book or any other book. Then evaluate the degree of ELF awareness that is inherent in the activities of that unit. See to what extent the activities themselves are ELF aware or not. In the third step, develop your own original metalinguistic and metacognitive questions to this particular chapter to help make it more self-aware, as we did with the examples we saw above. And finally, discuss with your tutor your rationale of these self-aware activities and exchange viewpoints with your colleagues. You will see that trying to do this will make you more confident as an self-aware teacher. Thank you for watching this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. Goodbye.